Okay, my name is Alison Morgan. I'm the curator of the Dudson Museum, and we're going to be learning a little bit more about it. The factory in Hope Street, which is where the museum is based, was opened in 1809 and is very typical of the factories of the day. The museum tells the story of one pottery company whose production spanned over 200 years. Also, it was run by the Dudson family for 8 generations, which is quite unique in the ceramic tableware industry. Very little was known about what Dudson produced way back in the 19th century. Because the site here was only under an acre, so consequently space was money. So successive management didn't really have the opportunity to store old order books and pattern books and things. They were simply discarded. But we were fortunate in finding 2 or 3 old ledgers. This is from 1840s. The only other evidence we had of early production at the time, that before the museum was created, was this set of the 4 seasons, which had been passed down through the Dudson family. And interestingly, if we get to the right page in that very ledger, here are the 4 seasons listed, 3 shillings. Another thing that, in addition to the ledgers, which helped us to piece the story together of Dudson, was that when the original factory site was renovated back in the 1980s and 90s, we were able to do an archaeological dig on site, and this yielded literally thousands of fragments. We can see here some of the work going on. And here are some of the fragments that were excavated. You can see how diverse they are. Everything from figures to jasperware. I always say to visitors, if they want to come and do a jigsaw puzzle in the museum, they're very welcome. They can put some fragments together. Blue and white, hand painted. These are very, very early fragments. And these are particularly important because these are known as mid-production shards. In other words, they are fragments that have been dug up on site, but they haven't been completed yet. So it's quite obvious that those would have been being produced on the site where they were found. There isn't any question that they could have been brought in, otherwise they would have been brought in as whole pieces and not part ones. By taking fragments round to antique fairs and auction houses and car boot sales even, we were able to match up those fragments to finished pieces. And this was how the story was added to. And we can see here that those mid-production shards actually match the finished pieces. Here are some more, this time the Staffordshire flatback. And these are what are known as pastille burners. They're actually early room fresheners where you could put in a scented pastel and then perfumed smoke would come out of the chimneys. And these are what the Victorians, well-heeled Victorians, would use to mask the smell of the lack of sanitation. If you weren't quite so well-heeled, you would just sprinkle lavender on the floor. We're looking now at more figures. The one on the left. We've never been quite sure what he is. I rather think he's a polar bear, and maybe a performing bear. These are some of the higher class figures that Dudson were making around about 1840. Again, candle holder and spill holder or inkwell. And this picture just illustrates different ways that, different characteristics in the way that the faces were painted, and that's helped us to identify other figures. Here we've got Mr. Pickwick and Sam Weller. And we know that the green of that base was a very distinctive green. Dudson were also colour makers, and we're pretty certain that they reserved that shade of green entirely for themselves. So that meant that that helped us to identify even more figures. And there's the green again. So we were able to expand the search. This little guy, he's quite interesting. He was actually not made on this site in Hope Street. He was made at another Dudson factory around the corner, which has long since closed down. But it's unusual because it's decorated in on-glaze enamels, and you can see some of those have actually worn off. And even more spectacularly, it's actually got R. Dudson on the base, which is very, very unusual. It's the only figure I've ever seen that's got a Dudson name on it. These are some shards or fragments that were dug up which have got a particular feature on them, and that is some what we call blue shredded clay, and that we think is a distinguishing factor for some but not all Dudson figures. If you look carefully at the base of those figures, you can see the blue shredded clay. And there's one with blue shredded clay and the same, obviously the same moulding, but without blue shredded clay. So they were obviously making them both ways. The image on the right there I love because it's got, can you see the lines in the back? That's actually fingerprints and tram lines where someone who's pressed the clay into the mould, and I find that quite tingling. Relief moulded pottery that we're looking at now was very much a bread and butter line for Dudson. These were quick to produce because the design was actually in the mould, and this afforded the company the opportunity to do the more elaborate pieces such as the jasperware. But it was functional, and lots of jugs were needed in Victorian times. You have to remember that there wasn't plastic invented, so we needed many jugs to contain everything from beer to water to custard to coffee. So we got three main lines for Dudson pottery. We had relief moulded stoneware, which is where the design is already in the mould. Then we've got mosaic, which is an inlaid pattern, and we've got jasperware. They were probably, in addition to figures, the three main lines for 19th century Dudson pottery. A little more on each of those topics. Here's relief moulded. You can see the design in the mould and how the actual finished piece can be decorated in different ways to get more mileage out of the mould. Looking at mosaic in a little bit more detail, here's a finished piece, and these are known as roulette wheels, and they were what were used to impress the soft clay, which was later infilled with a contrasting colour. And that's just some of the patterns that the wheels would make. And some more examples of finished pieces. Jasperware, again, some really nice examples there. Many different shades and lovely colours, from claret to sage. Here's some sprig moulds. We actually found about 4,000 were discovered on this site, on the Hope Street site. And having those sprig moulds for the jasperware has helped us to identify many more pieces of jasper. Here is some of Dudson's finest jasperware. We can see how translucent the applied motifs are, that you can actually see the blue of the background through the motifs, showing how delicate they are. So here we have a very important piece in the museum, which is a clock which was made for the Great Exhibition in 1851. James Dudson was holding the reins at the time, and he was obviously showing the world that he could make very attractive figures, and also, interestingly enough, he could do very intricate jasperware, which people usually associate just with Wedgwood, but Dudson made a tremendous amount of it. What's interesting about that is that if we look at the actual census page from 1851, it shows that James Dudson was employing 33 people, 2 men, 3 women, 12 boys and 16 girls. So that tiny workforce were making all the wonderful things that we've been looking at. James Thomas Dudson took over from James in 1882 when his father died, and it was he who masterminded the move into hotelware. He used the railways on business. He realised the importance of the railways and the fact that people were no longer on horse and cart or horseback. So a whole new industry was growing up, and he identified that. And because the style, the fashion for Victorian pottery was being made by every pottery in Stoke-on-Trent, he took the opportunity to move into the niche market of hospitality. When Dudson moved into hotelware, it was quite common for hotels and restaurants to want their name on the pottery. So early logos were developed, but they weren't the elaborate ones that we have today. They were just more like a simple rubber stamp. But we've got all sorts of examples here. And of course, Dudson made for the railways. They were huge customers of the company. Another change that happened with early hotelware was that hotels would request a glaze applied to jasperware, because as much as they would like to serve their afternoon tea on very fine jasperware, they felt it would be more easily washable if it had a shiny glaze on it. So that's rather different. Next to Wedgwood, Dudson made jasperware longer than any other company, and there were many companies who made that style of pottery. So here you've seen just a snapshot of what we can offer in the Dudson Museum. We've got many more stories, as you can imagine, through 219 years of history. So please come and see us, and we're happy to give everyone a tour.
Manufacturing continued here until, I would say, the mid-1980s, and it just became an impossible site to work with modern manufacturing techniques. Built in the traditional ways a Victorian pottery factory was, with lots of interconnecting but small rooms. So we found ourselves as a business putting all our investment into our 2 large sites where we had plenty of space and could automate from one process to the next. For those 15 years or so, there were specialist things that we could still justify using here. We still had somebody throwing by hand certain shapes that we couldn't automate. We had several people turning on a lathe still. So whilst there was still that need, then there was still a purpose for this site. But it got to the stage where we were only really using it for warehousing, and we started to turn our attention to what on earth do we do? We don't want to completely sever our ties with our original site. It was an important part of our history, and so from that point of view, but at the same time, it distracts financially from the day-to-day core business.
The clock we're looking at the back of the cabinet, that one is the actual original that was made for the exhibition. The one towards the front of the cabinet is a copy that was made for the company's bicentenary in 2000, and we made 50 copies just to prove that we could still do it, and many of those were auctioned off, and one was given to the Queen when she opened the centre here.
Your Majesty, on behalf of the Hindu Cultural Society of Staffordshire, these are our committee members. Would you please accept the garland on our behalf?
Although she toured the whole site with various people acting as hosts for their sections, it was my mother who quite rightly had the honour of showing the Queen around this particular part of the site. There were two grandmothers looking and poring over these various exhibits. You know, I think for Mum it was the icing on the cake, literally, of all her hard work and of putting the history into one place and into print. And at the same time, I think fascinating for Her Majesty to be shown the display like this that literally spans 200 years.
Sometime in the early 80s, mid-80s, they actually closed this site and it became derelict for some while without a great deal of purpose. My wife was working as a volunteer for Home Start, and they were housed in what was known as the Trent Centre in Leek Road. It was an old school. What happened then was the City Council had decided they wanted to use that site, the former school at the Trent Centre, for something else, and so we were given notice that we needed to find a new home. Alongside of that, the city were trying to bid for various European money and were looking for a flagship project to spearhead their bid. And there was a local architect called David Carr who had heard somewhere on the grapevine that Voluntary Action were looking for a new home. He'd seen the old Dudson factory and had lots of connections into the Dudson family, particularly Ian Dudson, who is now the managing director. And we were approached to have a meeting, which we hosted at our offices at Festival Park. And David was making soundings to see if we would be interested in hosting and being head tenant in a vision of turning the Dudson Centre into a hub for the voluntary sector, so restoring it, so as it was at the gateway to Handley, if you were coming from Burzon or Tunstall, it was a bit of an eyesore, and would we be prepared to get involved in that project? And so the Dudson Centre charity was formed and a project kicked off, I think, in around 1996 eventually. And I've helped the symmetry between voluntary action working with the Dudson Centre and to some extent the local authority. It's the three-way agreement. And that's been very successful in terms of, occupancy. We have done what we said we would always do with this building, which is to allow small organisations to grow in a relatively low-cost environment, fully serviced, and then as they grow, they either expand with more rooms here or then go elsewhere because they've outgrown us. But then we can bring in other smaller groups. So I've lost count of how many groups we have gone through this. Within that, there's always been the museum. So the museum was very much funded by the Dudson organisation. And I've sat on some of the groups where we've done some brainstorming and worked out how we can make this affordable, how voluntary action can now take this under their wing and seek funding, etc. And that again is going very well. We've just had the exciting news that we've received a grant towards being able to develop it. And that the whole idea eventually is to make, whilst we have to be very respectful of lots of organisations occupying here, we have a much bigger museum than just the bottle kiln and the contents. So we're trying to theme some of the rooms now and make it more of an experience when you visit here. And I'm sure anybody who comes here will see it's a fantastic place.
And I think we can fairly say that it has been that cocktail of aims and objectives has proved to be very successful and recognised as such.
We have managed to entwine a business that was part of the community and employing people and therefore an important part of the economic fabric. And as that's declined, we've merged that now into the voluntary sector, which is very much a charitable and volunteer. So it's still a community asset. And what we've done is enabled things that are industrial. Certainly when they were industrial, were not viewed as being pretty. They were never designed to be pretty. But increasingly, we're able to acknowledge our heritage and see the beauty in some of the design, particularly when we're able to adopt something that was designed for X to be imaginative. And this is imaginative. It evokes an architectural excellence, even though it's just a simple brick construction. It's a lot of things to a lot of people. We've got the cafe, which is vibrant. You've got people who can come and visit this for, aesthetic reasons. You've got people who are interested in property. We can show visitors to our city what our heritage is. And we also say we've got a thriving community hub as well.